This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Daniel Deronda by George Eliot. Chapter 25. How trace the why and wherefore in a mind reduced to the barrenness of a fastidious egoism, in which all direct desires are dulled, and have dwindled from motives into a vacillating expectation of motives, a mind made up of moods, where a fitful impulse springs here and there conspicuously rank amid the general weediness. 'Tis a condition apt to befall a life too much at large, unmolded by the pressure of obligation. Nem deterioris omne sumus licentiae, or, as a more familiar tongue might deliver it, as you like is a bad finger-post. Potentates make known their intentions and affect the funds at a small expense of words. So when Grandcourt, after learning that Gwendolen had left Leubronn, incidentally pronounced that resort of fashion a beastly hole worse than Baden, the remark was conclusive to Mr. Lush that his patron intended straightway to return to Diplow. The execution was sure to be slower than the intention, and in fact Grandcourt did loiter through the next day without giving any distinct orders about departure, perhaps because he discerned that Lush was expecting them. He lingered over his toilette, and certainly came down with a faded aspect of perfect distinction which made fresh complexions and hands with the blood in them seem signs of raw vulgarity. He lingered on the terrace, in the gambling rooms, in the reading room, occupying himself in being indifferent to everybody and everything around him. When he met Lady Mallinger, however, he took some trouble, raised his hat, paused, and proved that he listened to her recommendation of the waters by replying, "Yes, I heard somebody say how providential it was that there always happened to be springs at gambling places." "Oh, that was a joke," said innocent Lady Mallinger, misled by Grandcourt's languid seriousness. "An imitation of the old one about the towns and the rivers, you know." "Ah, perhaps," said Grandcourt, without change of expression. Lady Mallinger thought this worth telling to Sir Hugo, who said, "Oh, my dear, he is not a fool. You must not suppose that he can't see a joke. He can play his cards as well as most of us." "He has never seemed to me a very sensible man," said Lady Mallinger, in excuse of herself. She had a secret objection to meeting Grandcourt, who was little else to her than a large living sign of what she felt to be her failure as a wife, the not having presented Sir Hugo with a son. Her constant reflection was that her husband might fairly regret his choice, and if he had not been very good might have treated her with some roughness in consequence, gentlemen naturally disliking to be disappointed. Deronda too had a recognition from Grandcourt, for which he was not grateful, though he took care to return it with perfect civility. No reasoning as to the foundations of custom could do away with the early-rooted feeling that his birth had been attended with injury for which his father was to blame. And seeing that but for this injury Grandcourt's prospects might have been his, he was proudly resolute not to behave in any way that might be interpreted into irritation on that score. He saw a very easy descent into mean unreasoning rancor and triumph in others' frustration, and being determined not to go down that ugly pit, he turned his back on it, clinging to the kindlier affections within him as a possession. Pride certainly helped him well, the pride of not recognizing a disadvantage for one's self which vulgar minds are disposed to exaggerate, such as the shabby equipage of poverty. He would not have a man like Grandcourt suppose himself envied by him. But there is no guarding against interpretation. Grandcourt did believe that Deronda, poor devil, who he had no doubt was his cousin by the father's side, inwardly winced under their mutual position. Therefore the presence of that less lucky person was more agreeable to him than it would otherwise have been. An imaginary envy, the idea that others feel their comparative deficiency, is the ordinary cortege of egoism, and his pet dogs were not the only beings that Grandcourt liked to feel his power over in making them jealous. Hence he was civil enough to exchange several words with Deronda on the terrace about the hunting round Diplow, and even said, "You had better come over for a run or two when the season begins." Lush, not displeased with delay, amused himself very well, partly in gossiping with Sir Hugo and in answering his questions about Grandcourt's affairs so far as they might affect his willingness to part with his interest in Diplow. Also about Grandcourt's personal entanglements, the baronet knew enough already for Lush to feel released from silence on a sunny autumn day, when there was nothing more agreeable to do in lounging promenades than to speak freely of a tyrannous patron behind his back. Sir Hugo willingly inclined his ear to a little good-humored scandal, which he was fond of calling trait de mœurs, but he was strict in keeping such communications from hearers who might take them too seriously. Whatever knowledge he had of his nephew's secrets, he had never spoken of it to Deronda, who considered Grandcourt a pale-blooded mortal, but was far from wishing to hear how the red corpuscles had been washed out of him. It was Lush's policy and inclination to gratify everybody when he had no reason to the contrary, and the baronet always treated him well, as one of those easy-handled personages who, frequenting the society of gentlemen without being exactly gentlemen themselves, can be the more serviceable, like the second-best articles of our wardrobe, which we use with a comfortable freedom from anxiety. "Well, you will let me know the turn of events," said Sir Hugo, "if this marriage seems likely to come off after all, or if anything else happens to make the want of money pressing. My plan would be much better for him than burdening Ryelands." "That's true," said Lush, "only it must not be urged on him, just placed in his way that the scent may tickle him. Grandcourt is not a man to be always led by what makes for his own interest, especially if you let him see that it makes for your interest too. I'm attached to him, of course. I have given up everything else for the sake of keeping by him, and it has lasted a good 15 years now. He would not easily get any one else to fill my place. He's a peculiar character, is Henleigh Grandcourt, and it has been growing on him of late years. However, I'm of a constant disposition, and I've been a sort of guardian to him since he was 20. An uncommonly fascinating fellow he was then, to be sure, and could be now if he liked. I'm attached to him. It would be a good deal worse for him if he missed me at his elbow." Sir Hugo did not think it needful to express his sympathy or even assent, and perhaps Lush himself did not expect this sketch of his motives to be taken as exact. But how can a man avoid himself as a subject in conversation? And he must make some sort of decent toilette in words, as in cloth and linen. Lush's listener was not severe. A member of Parliament could allow for the necessities of verbal toilette, and the dialogue went on without any change of mutual estimate. However, Lush's easy prospect of indefinite procrastination was cut off the next morning by Grandcourt saluting him with the question, "Are you making all the arrangements for our starting by the Paris train?" "I didn't know you meant to start," said Lush, not exactly taken by surprise. "You might have known," said Grandcourt, looking at the burned length of his cigar, and speaking in that lowered tone which was usual with him when he meant to express disgust and be peremptory. "Just see to everything, will you? And mind no brute gets into the same carriage with us. And leave my P.P.C. at the Mallingers'." In consequence, they were at Paris the next day, but here Lush was gratified by the proposal or command that he should go straight on to Diplow and see that everything was right, while Grandcourt and the valet remained behind; and it was not until several days later that Lush received the telegram ordering the carriage to the Wanchester station. He had used the interim actively, not only in carrying out Grandcourt's orders about the stud and household, but in learning all he could of Gwendolen and how things were going on at Offendene. What was the probable effect that the news of the family misfortunes would have on Grandcourt's fitful obstinacy he felt to be quite incalculable. So far as the girl's poverty might be an argument that she would accept an offer from him now in spite of any previous coyness, it might remove that bitter objection to risk a repulse which Lush divined to be one of Grandcourt's deterring motives. On the other hand, the certainty of acceptance was just the sort of thing to make him lapse hither and thither with no more apparent will than a moth. Lush had had his patron under close observation for many years, and knew him perhaps better than he knew any other subject. But to know Grandcourt was to doubt what he would do in any particular case. It might happen that he would behave with an apparent magnanimity, like the hero of a modern French drama, whose sudden start into moral splendor after much lying and meanness leaves you little confidence as to any part of his career that may follow the fall of the curtain. Indeed, what attitude would have been more honorable for a final scene than that of declining to seek an heiress for her money, and determining to marry the attractive girl who had none? But Lush had some general certainties about Grandcourt, and one was that of all inward movements those of generosity were least likely to occur in him. Of what use, however, is a general certainty that an insect will not walk with his head hindmost, when what you need to know is the play of inward stimulus that sends him hither and thither in a network of possible paths? Thus Lush was much at fault as to the probable issue between Grandcourt and Gwendolen, when what he desired was a perfect confidence that they would never be married. He would have consented willingly that Grandcourt should marry an heiress, or that he should marry Mrs. Glasher. In the one match there would have been the immediate abundance that prospective heirship could not supply, and in the other there would have been the security of the wife's gratitude, for Lush had always been Mrs. Glasher's friend, and that the future Mrs. Grandcourt should not be socially received could not affect his private comfort. He would not have minded either that there should be no marriage in question at all, but he felt himself justified in doing his utmost to hinder a marriage with a girl who was likely to bring nothing but trouble to her husband, not to speak of annoyance if not ultimate injury to her husband's old companion, whose future Mr. Lush earnestly wished to make as easy as possible, considering that he had well deserved such compensation for leading a dog's life, though that of a dog who enjoyed many tastes undisturbed and who profited by a large establishment. He wished for himself what he felt to be good, and was not conscious of wishing harm to any one else, unless perhaps it were just now a little harm to the inconvenient and impertinent Gwendolen. But the easiest humored of luxury and music, the toad-eater the least liable to nausea, must be expected to have his susceptibilities. And Mr. Lush was accustomed to be treated by the world in general as an apt, agreeable fellow. He had not made up his mind to be insulted by more than one person. With this imperfect preparation of a war policy, Lush was awaiting Grandcourt's arrival, doing little more than wondering how the campaign would begin. The first day Grandcourt was much occupied with the stables, and amongst other things he ordered a groom to put a side-saddle on Criterion and let him review the horse's paces. This marked indication of purpose set Lush on considering over again whether he should incur the ticklish consequences of speaking first, while he was still sure that no compromising step had been taken. And he rose the next morning almost resolved that if Grandcourt seemed in as good a humor as yesterday and entered at all into talk, he would let drop the interesting facts about Gwendolen and her family, just to see how they would work, and to get some guidance. But Grandcourt did not enter into talk, and in answer to a question even about his own convenience, no fish could have maintained a more unwinking silence. After he had read his letters, he gave the various orders to be executed or transmitted by Lush, and then thrust his shoulder toward that useful person, who accordingly arose to leave the room. But before he was out of the door, Grandcourt turned his head slightly, and gave a broken, languid "Oh." "What is it?" said Lush, who, it must have been observed, did not take his dusty puddings with a respectful air. "Shut the door, will you? I can't speak into the corridor." Lush closed the door, came forward, and chose to sit down. After a little pause Grandcourt said, "Is Miss Harleth at Offendene?" He was quite certain that Lush had made it his business to inquire about her, and he had some pleasure in thinking that Lush did not want him to inquire. "Well, I hardly know," said Lush, carelessly. "The family's utterly done up. They and the Gascons, too, have lost all their money. It's owing to some rascally banking business. The poor mother hasn't a sou, it seems. She and the girls have to huddle themselves into a little cottage like a laborer's." "Don't lie to me, if you please," said Grandcourt, in his lowest audible tone. "It's not amusing, and it answers no other purpose." "What do you mean?" said Lush, more nettled than was common with him, the prospect before him being more than commonly disturbing. "Just tell me the truth, will you?" "It's no invention of mine. I have heard the story from several. Bazley, Brackenshaw's man, for one. He is getting a new tenant for Offendene." "I don't mean that. Is Miss Harleth there, or is she not?" said Grandcourt, in his former tone. "Upon my soul, I can't tell," said Lush, rather sulkily. "She may have left yesterday. I heard she had taken a situation as governess. She may be gone to it for what I know. But if you wanted to see her, no doubt the mother would send for her back." This sneer slipped off his tongue without strict intention. "Send Hutchins to inquire whether she will be there to-morrow." Lush did not move. Like many persons who have thought over beforehand what they shall say in given cases, he was impelled by an unexpected irritation to say some of those prearranged things before the cases were given. Grandcourt, in fact, was likely to get into a scrape so tremendous that it was impossible to let him take the first step toward it without remonstrance. Lush retained enough caution to use a tone of rational friendliness. Still he felt his own value to his patron, and was prepared to be daring. "It would be as well for you to remember, Grandcourt, that you are coming under closer fire now. There can be none of the ordinary flirting done, which may mean everything or nothing. You must make up your mind whether you wish to be accepted, and more than that, how you would like being refused. Either one or the other. You can't be philandering after her again for 6 weeks." Grandcourt said nothing, but pressed the newspaper down on his knees and began to light another cigar. Lush took this as a sign that he was willing to listen, and was the more bent on using the opportunity. He wanted, if possible, to find out which would be the more potent cause of hesitation—probable acceptance or probable refusal. "Everything has a more serious look now than it had before. There is her family to be provided for. You could not let your wife's mother live in beggary. It would be a confoundedly hampering affair. Marriage will pin you down in a way you haven't been used to, and in point of money you have not too much elbow-room. And after all, what will you get by it? You are master over your estates, present or future. As far as choosing your heir goes, it's a pity to go on encumbering them for a mere whim, which you may repent of in a 12-month. I should be sorry to see you making a mess of your life in that way. If there were anything solid to be gained by the marriage, that would be a different affair." Lush's tone had gradually become more and more unctuous in its friendliness of remonstrance, and he was almost in danger of forgetting that he was merely gambling in argument. When he left off, Grandcourt took his cigar out of his mouth, and looking steadily at the moist end while he adjusted the leaf with his delicate finger-tips, said, "I knew before that you had an objection to my marrying Miss Harleth." Here he made a little pause before he continued. "But I never considered that a reason against it." "I never supposed you did," answered Lush, not unctuously but dryly. "It was not that I urged as a reason. I should have thought it might have been a reason against it, after all your experience, that you would be acting like the hero of a ballad and making yourself absurd. And all for what? You know you couldn't make up your mind before. It's impossible you can care much about her. And as for the tricks she is likely to play, you may judge of that from what you heard at Leubronn. However, what I wished to point out to you was, that there can be no shilly-shally now." "Perfectly," said Grandcourt, looking round at Lush and fixing him with narrow eyes. "I don't intend that there should be. I dare say it's disagreeable to you. But if you suppose I care a damn for that, you are most stupendously mistaken." "Oh, well," said Lush, rising with his hands in his pockets and feeling some latent venom still within him, "if you have made up your mind. Only there's another aspect of the affair. I have been speaking on the supposition that it was absolutely certain she would accept you, and that destitution would have no choice. But I am not so sure that the young lady is to be counted on. She is a kittle-cattle to shoe, I think, and she had her reasons for running away before." Lush had moved a step or two till he stood nearly in front of Grandcourt, though at some distance from him. He did not feel himself much restrained by consequences, being aware that the only stronghold he had on his present position was his serviceableness, and even after a quarrel the want of him was likely sooner or later to recur. He foresaw that Gwendolen would cause him to be ousted for a time, and his temper at this moment urged him to risk a quarrel. "She had her reasons," he repeated more significantly. "I had come to that conclusion before," said Grandcourt, with contemptuous irony. "Yes, but I hardly think you know what her reasons were." "You do, apparently," said Grandcourt, not betraying by so much as an eyelash that he cared for the reasons. "Yes, and you had better know too that you may judge of the influence you have over her if she swallows her reasons and accepts you. For my own part, I would take odds against it. She saw Lydia in Cardell Chase, and heard the whole story." Grandcourt made no immediate answer, and only went on smoking. He was so long before he spoke that Lush moved about and looked out of the windows, unwilling to go away without seeing some effect of his daring move. He had expected that Grandcourt would tax him with having contrived the affair, since Mrs. Glasher was then living at Gadsmere, 100 miles off, and he was prepared to admit the fact. What he cared about was that Grandcourt should be staggered by the sense that his intended advances must be made to a girl who had that knowledge in her mind and had been scared by it. At length Grandcourt, seeing Lush turn toward him, looked at him again and said contemptuously, "What follows?" Here certainly was a mate in answer to Lush's check, and though his exasperation with Grandcourt was perhaps stronger than it had ever been before, it would have been idiocy to act as if any further move could be useful. He gave a slight shrug with one shoulder, and was going to walk away, when Grandcourt turned on his seat toward the table, and as quietly as if nothing had occurred, "Oblige me by pushing that pen and paper here, will you?" No thunderous bullying superior could have exercised the imperious spell that Grandcourt did. Why, instead of being obeyed, he had never been told to go to a warmer place was perhaps a mystery to those who found themselves obeying him. The pen and paper were pushed to him, and as he took them he said, "Just wait for this letter." He scrawled with ease, and the brief note was quickly addressed. "Let Hutchins go with it at once, will you?" said Grandcourt, pushing the letter away from him. As Lush had expected, it was addressed to Miss Harleth, Offendene. When his irritation had cooled down he was glad there had been no explosive quarrel, but he felt sure that there was a notch made against him, and that somehow or other he was intended to pay. It was also clear to him that the immediate effect of his revelation had been to harden Grandcourt's previous determination. But as to the particular movements that made this process in his baffling mind, Lush could only toss up his chin in despair of a theory. End of chapter 25. This recording is in the public domain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Daniel Deronda by George Eliot. Chapter 26. He brings white asses laden with the freight of Tyrian vessels, purple, gold, and balm, to bribe my will. I'll bid them chase him forth, nor let him breathe the taint of his surmise on my secure resolve. Aye, 'tis secure, and therefore let him come to spread his freight. For firmness hath its appetite, and craves the stronger lure more strongly to resist. Would know the touch of gold to fling it off, scent wine to feel its lip the soberer. Behold soft byssus, ivory, and plumes to say, "They're fair, but I will none of them," and flout enticement in the very face. Mr. Gascoigne one day came to Offendene with what he felt to be the satisfactory news that Mrs. Mompert had fixed Tuesday in the following week for her interview with Gwendolen at Wanchester. He said nothing of his having incidentally heard that Mr. Grandcourt had returned to Diplow, knowing no more than she did that Leubronn had been the goal of her admirer's journeying, and feeling that it would be unkind uselessly to revive the memory of a brilliant prospect under the present reverses. In his secret soul he thought of his niece's unintelligible caprice with regret, but he vindicated her to himself by considering that Grandcourt had been the first to behave oddly, in suddenly walking away when there had been the best opportunity for crowning his marked attentions. The rector's practical judgment told him that his chief duty to his niece now was to encourage her resolutely to face the change in her lot, since there was no manifest promise of any event that would avert it. "You will find an interest in varied experience, my dear, and I have no doubt you will be a more valuable woman for having sustained such a part as you are called to." "I cannot pretend to believe that I shall like it," said Gwendolen, for the first time showing her uncle some petulance. "But I am quite aware that I am obliged to bear it." She remembered having submitted to his admonition on a different occasion, when she was expected to like a very different prospect. "And your good sense will teach you to behave suitably under it," said Mr. Gascoigne, with a shade more gravity. "I feel sure that Mrs. Mompert will be pleased with you. You will know how to conduct yourself to a woman who holds in all senses the relation of a superior to you. This trouble has come on you young, but that makes it in some respects easier, and there is a benefit in all chastisement if we adjust our minds to it." This was precisely what Gwendolen was unable to do, and after her uncle was gone the bitter tears which had rarely come during the late trouble rose and fell slowly as she sat alone. Her heart denied that the trouble was easier because she was young. When was she to have any happiness if it did not come when she was young? Not that her visions of possible happiness for herself were as unmixed with necessary evil as they used to be. Not that she could still imagine herself plucking the fruits of life without suspicion of their core. But this general disenchantment with the world, nay, with herself, since it appeared that she was not made for easy preeminence, only intensified her sense of forlornness. It was a visibly sterile distance enclosing the dreary path at her feet, in which she had no courage to tread. She was in that first crisis of passionate youthful rebellion against what is not fitly called pain, but rather the absence of joy, that first rage of disappointment in life's morning, which we whom the years have subdued are apt to remember but dimly as part of our own experience, and so to be intolerant of its self-enclosed unreasonableness and impiety. What passion seems more absurd when we have just got outside it and looked at calamity as a collective risk, than this amazed anguish that I, and not thou, he or she, should be just the smitten one? Yet perhaps some who have afterward made themselves a willing fence before the breast of another, and have carried their own heart wound in heroic silence, some who have made their deeds great, nevertheless began with this angry amazement at their own smart, and on the mere denial of their fantastic desires raged as if under the sting of wasps which reduced the universe for them to an unjust infliction of pain. This was nearly poor Gwendolen's condition. What though such a reverse as hers had often happened to other girls? The one point she had been all her life learning to care for was, that it had happened to her. It was what she felt under Klesmer's demonstration that she was not remarkable enough to command fortune by force of will and merit. It was what she would feel under the rigors of Mrs. Mompert's constant expectation, under the dull demand that she should be cheerful with 3 Miss Momperts, under the necessity of showing herself entirely submissive and keeping her thoughts to herself. To be a queen disthroned is not so hard as some other downstepping. Imagine one who had been made to believe in his own divinity finding all homage withdrawn, and himself unable to perform a miracle that would recall the homage and restore his own confidence. Something akin to this illusion and this helplessness had fallen the poor spoiled child, with the lovely lips and eyes and the majestic figure, which seemed now to have no magic in them. She rose from the low ottoman where she had been sitting purposeless, and walked up and down the drawing-room, resting her elbow on one palm while she leaned down her cheek on the other, and a slow tear fell. She thought, "I have always, ever since I was little, felt that mamma was not a happy woman, and now I dare say I shall be more unhappy than she has been." Her mind dwelt for a few moments on the picture of herself losing her youth and ceasing to enjoy, not minding whether she did this or that, but such picturing inevitably brought back the image of her mother. Poor mamma! It will be still worse for her now. I can get a little money for her. That is all I shall care about now." And then with an entirely new movement of her imagination, she saw her mother getting quite old and white, and herself no longer young but faded, and their two faces meeting still with memory and love, and she knowing what was in her mother's mind. "Poor Gwen is too sad and faded now." And then, for the first time, she sobbed, not in anger, but with a sort of tender misery. Her face was toward the door, and she saw her mother enter. She barely saw that, for her eyes were large with tears, and she pressed her handkerchief against them hurriedly. Before she took it away she felt her mother's arms round her, and this sensation, which seemed a prolongation of her inward vision, overcame her will to be reticent. She sobbed anew in spite of herself, as they pressed their cheeks together. Mrs. Davilow had brought something in her hand which had already caused her an agitating anxiety, and she dared not speak until her darling had become calmer. But Gwendolen, with whom weeping had always been a painful manifestation to be resisted if possible, again pressed her handkerchief against her eyes, and with a deep breath drew her head backward and looked at her mother, who was pale and tremulous. "It was nothing, mamma," said Gwendolen, thinking that her mother had been moved in this way simply by finding her in distress. "It is all over now." But Mrs. Davilow had withdrawn her arms, and Gwendolen perceived a letter in her hand. "What is that letter? Worse news still?" she asked, with a touch of bitterness. "I don't know what you will think it, dear," said Mrs. Davilow, keeping the letter in her hand. "You will hardly guess where it comes from." "Don't ask me to guess anything," said Gwendolen, rather impatiently, as if a bruise were being pressed. "It is addressed to you, dear." Gwendolen gave the slightest perceptible toss of the head. "It comes from Diplow," said Mrs. Davilow, giving her the letter. She knew Grandcourt's indistinct handwriting, and her mother was not surprised to see her blush deeply, but watching her as she read, and wondering much what was the purport of the letter, she saw the color die out. Gwendolen's lips even were pale as she turned the open note toward her mother. The words were few and formal. "Mr. Grandcourt presents his compliments to Miss Harleth, and begs to know whether he may be permitted to call at Offendene to-morrow after 2, and to see her alone. Mr. Grandcourt has just returned from Leubronn, where he had hoped to find Miss Harleth." Mrs. Davilow read, and then looked at her daughter inquiringly, leaving the note in her hand. Gwendolen let it fall to the floor and turned away. "It must be answered, darling," said Mrs. Davilow, timidly. "The man waits." Gwendolen sank on the settee, clasped her hands, and looked straight before her, not at her mother. She had the expression of one who had been startled by a sound and was listening to know what would come of it. The sudden change of the situation was bewildering. A few minutes before she was looking along an inescapable path of repulsive monotony, with hopeless inward rebellion against the imperious lot which left her no choice, and lo, now a moment of choice was come. Yet was it triumph she felt most, or terror? Impossible for Gwendolen not to feel some triumph in a tribute to her power at a time when she was first tasting the bitterness of insignificance. Again she seemed to be getting a sort of empire over her own life. But how to use it? Here came the terror. Quick, quick, like pictures in a book beaten open with a sense of hurry, came back vividly, yet in fragments, all that she had gone through in relation to Grandcourt: the allurements, the vacillations, the resolve to accede, the final repulsion, the incisive face of that dark-eyed lady with the lovely boy. Her own pledge—was it a pledge not to marry him? The new disbelief in the worth of men and things for which that scene of disclosure had become a symbol. That unalterable experience made a vision, at which in the first agitated moment, before temporary reflections could suggest themselves, her native terror shrank. Where was the good of choice coming again? What did she wish? Anything different? No. And yet in the dark seed-growths of consciousness a new wish was forming itself. "I wish I had never known it." Something, anything she wished for that would have saved her from the dread to let Grandcourt come. It was no long while, yet it seemed long to Mrs. Davilow before she thought it well to say gently, "It will be necessary for you to write, dear, or shall I write an answer for you, which you will dictate?" "No, mamma," said Gwendolen, drawing a deep breath. "But please lay me out the pen and paper." That was gaining time. Was she to decline Grandcourt's visit, close the shutters, not even look out on what would happen, though with the assurance that she should remain just where she was? The young activity within her made a warm current through her terror and stirred toward something that would be an event, toward an opportunity in which she could look and speak with the former effectiveness. The interest of the morrow was no longer at a deadlock. "There is really no reason on earth why you should be so alarmed at the man's waiting a few minutes, mamma," said Gwendolen remonstrantly, as Mrs. Davilow, having prepared the writing materials, looked toward her expectantly. "Servants expect nothing else than to wait. It is not to be supposed that I must write on the instant." "No, dear," said Mrs. Davilow, in the tone of one corrected, turning to sit down and take up a bit of work that lay at hand. "He can wait another quarter of an hour, if you like." It was very simple speech and action on her part, but it was what might have been subtly calculated. Gwendolen felt a contradictory desire to be hastened. Hurry would save her from deliberate choice. "I did not mean him to wait long enough for that needlework to be finished," she said, lifting her hands to stroke the backward curves of her hair, while she rose from her seat and stood still. "But if you don't feel able to decide?" said Mrs. Davilow, sympathizingly. "I must decide," said Gwendolen, walking to the writing table and seating herself. All the while there was a busy undercurrent in her, like the thought of a man who keeps up a dialogue while he is considering how he can slip away. Why should she not let him come? It bound her to nothing. He had been to Leubronn after her. Of course he meant a direct unmistakable renewal of the suit which before had been only implied. What then? She could reject him. Why was she to deny herself the freedom of doing this, which she would like to do? "If Mr. Grandcourt has only just returned from Leubronn," said Mrs. Davilow, observing that Gwendolen leaned back in her chair after taking the pen in her hand, "I wonder whether he has heard of our misfortunes." "That could make no difference to a man in his position," said Gwendolen, rather contemptuously. "It would to some men," said Mrs. Davilow. "They would not like to take a wife from a family in a state of beggary almost, as we are. Here we are at Offendene with a great shell over us, as usual. But just imagine his finding us at Sawyer's Cottage. Most men are afraid of being bored or taxed by a wife's family. If Mr. Grandcourt did know, I think it a strong proof of his attachment to you." Mrs. Davilow spoke with unusual emphasis. It was the first time she had ventured to say anything about Grandcourt which would necessarily seem intended as an argument in favor of him, her habitual impression being that such arguments would certainly be useless and might be worse. The effect of her words now was stronger than she could imagine. They raised a new set of possibilities in Gwendolen's mind, a vision of what Grandcourt might do for her mother if she, Gwendolen, did what she was not going to do. She was so moved by a new rush of ideas that, like one conscious of being urgently called away, she felt that the immediate task must be hastened. The letter must be written, else it might be endlessly deferred. After all, she acted in a hurry, as she had wished to do. To act in a hurry was to have a reason for keeping away from an absolute decision, and to leave open as many issues as possible. She wrote, "Miss Harleth presents her compliments to Mr. Grandcourt. She will be at home after 2 o'clock tomorrow." Before addressing the note she said, "Pray ring the bell, mamma, if there is any one to answer it." She really did not know who did the work of the house. It was not till after the letter had been taken away and Gwendolen had risen again, stretching out one arm and then resting it on her head with a low moan which had a sound of relief in it, that Mrs. Davilow ventured to ask, "What did you say, Gwen?" "I said that I should be at home," answered Gwendolen, rather loftily. Then after a pause, "You must not expect, because Mr. Grandcourt is coming, that anything is going to happen, mamma." "I don't allow myself to expect anything, dear. I desire you to follow your own feeling. You have never told me what that was." "What is the use of telling?" said Gwendolen, hearing a reproach in that true statement. "When I have anything pleasant to tell, you may be sure I will tell you." "But Mr. Grandcourt will consider that you have already accepted him in allowing him to come. His note tells you plainly enough that he is coming to make you an offer." "Very well. And I wish to have the pleasure of refusing him." Mrs. Davilow looked up in wonderment, but Gwendolen implied her wish not to be questioned further by saying, "Put down that detestable needlework, and let us walk in the avenue. I am stifled." Chapter 26. This recording is in the public domain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Daniel Deronda, by George Eliot. Chapter 27. Desire has trimmed the sails, and circumstance brings but the breeze to fill them. While Grandcourt on his beautiful black Yarico, the groom behind him on Criterion, was taking the pleasant ride from Diplow to Offendene, Gwendolen was seated before the mirror while her mother gathered up the lengthy mass of light brown hair which she had been carefully brushing. "Only gather it up easily and make a coil, mamma," said Gwendolen. "Let me bring you some earrings, Gwen," said Mrs. Davilow, when the hair was adjusted, and they were both looking at the reflection in the glass. It was impossible for them not to notice that the eyes looked brighter than they had done of late, that there seemed to be a shadow lifted from the face, leaving all the lines once more in their placid youthfulness. The mother drew some inference that made her voice rather cheerful. "You do want your earrings?" "No, mamma, I shall not wear any ornaments, and I shall put on my black silk. Black is the only wear when one is going to refuse an offer," said Gwendolen, with one of her old smiles at her mother, while she rose to throw off her dressing-gown. "Suppose the offer is not made after all," said Mrs. Davilow, not without a sly intention. "Then that will be because I refuse it beforehand," said Gwendolen. "It comes to the same thing." There was a proud little toss of the head as she said this, and when she walked downstairs in her long black robes, there was just that firm poise of head and elasticity of form which had lately been missing, as in a parched plant. Her mother thought, "She is quite herself again. It must be pleasure in his coming. Can her mind be really made up against him?" Gwendolen would have been rather angry if that thought had been uttered, perhaps all the more because through the last 20 hours, with a brief interruption of sleep, she had been so occupied with perpetually alternating images and arguments for and against the possibility of her marrying Grandcourt, that the conclusion which she had determined on beforehand ceased to have any hold on her consciousness. The alternate dip of counterbalancing thoughts begotten of counterbalancing desires had brought her into a state in which no conclusion could look fixed to her. She would have expressed her resolve as before, but it was a form out of which the blood had been sucked, no more a part of quivering life than the "God's will be done" of one who is eagerly watching the chances. She did not mean to accept Grandcourt. From the first moment of receiving his letter she had meant to refuse him. Still that could not but prompt her to look the unwelcome reasons full in the face until she had a little less awe of them, could not hinder her imagination from filling out her knowledge in various ways, some of which seemed to change the aspect of what she knew. By dint of looking at a dubious object with a constructive imagination, who can give it 20 different shapes? Her indistinct grounds of hesitation before the interview at the Whispering Stones at present counted for nothing. They were all merged in the final repulsion. If it had not been for that day in Cardell Chase, she said to herself now, there would have been no obstacle to her marrying Grandcourt. On that day and after it she had not reasoned and balanced. She had acted with a force of impulse against which all questioning was no more than a voice against a torrent. The impulse had come, not only from her maidenly pride and jealousy, not only from the shock of another woman's calamity thrust close on her vision, but from her dread of wrong-doing, which was vague, it was true, and aloof from the daily details of her life, but not the less strong. Whatever was accepted as consistent with being a lady she had no scruple about, but from the dim region of what was called disgraceful, wrong, guilty, she shrunk with mingled pride and terror, and even apart from shame, her feeling would have made her place any deliberate injury of another in the region of guilt. But now, did she know exactly what was the state of the case with regard to Mrs. Glasher and her children? She had given a sort of promise, had said, "I will not interfere with your wishes." But would another woman who married Grandcourt be in fact the decisive obstacle to her wishes, or be doing her and her boy any real injury? Might it not be just as well, nay better, that Grandcourt should marry? For what could not a woman do when she was married, if she knew how to assert herself? Here all was constructive imagination. Gwendolen had about as accurate a conception of marriage, that is to say, of the mutual influences, demands, duties of man and woman in the state of matrimony, as she had of magnetic currents and the law of storms. "Mamma managed badly," was her way of summing up what she had seen of her mother's experience. She herself would manage quite differently. And the trials of matrimony were the last theme into which Mrs. Davilow could choose to enter fully with this daughter. "I wonder what mamma and my uncle would say if they knew about Mrs. Glasher," thought Gwendolen in her inward debating. Not that she could imagine herself telling them, even if she had not felt bound to silence. "I wonder what anybody would say, or what they would say to Mr. Grandcourt's marrying some one else and having other children." To consider what anybody would say was to be released from the difficulty of judging where everything was obscure to her when feeling had ceased to be decisive. She had only to collect her memories, which proved to her that anybody regarded the illegitimate children as more rightfully to be looked shy on and deprived of social advantages than illegitimate fathers. The verdict of anybody seemed to be that she had no reason to concern herself greatly on behalf of Mrs. Glasher and her children. But there was another way in which they had caused her concern. What others might think could not do away with a feeling which in the first instance would hardly be too strongly described as indignation and loathing that she should have been expected to unite herself with an outworn life, full of backward secrets which must have been more keenly felt than any association with her. True, the question of love on her own part had occupied her scarcely at all in relation to Grandcourt. The desirability of marriage for her had always seemed due to other feeling than love, and to be enamored was the part of the man, on whom the advances depended. Gwendolen had found no objection to Grandcourt's way of being enamored before she had had that glimpse of his past, which she resented as if it had been a deliberate offense against her. His advances to her were deliberate, and she felt a retrospective disgust for them. Perhaps other men's lives were of the same kind, full of secrets which made the ignorant suppositions of the women they wanted to marry a farce at which they were laughing in their sleeves. These feelings of disgust and indignation had sunk deep, and though other troublous experience in the last weeks had dulled them from passion into remembrance, it was chiefly their reverberating activity which kept her firm to the understanding with herself that she was not going to accept Grandcourt. She had never meant to form a new determination. She had only been considering what might be thought or said. If anything could have induced her to change, it would have been the prospect of making all things easy for poor mamma. That, she admitted, was a temptation. But no, she was going to refuse him. Meanwhile the thought that he was coming to be refused was inspiriting. She had the white reins in her hands again. There was a new current in her frame, reviving her from the beaten-down consciousness in which she had been left by the interview with Klesmer. She was not now going to crave an opinion of her capabilities. She was going to exercise her power. Was this what made her heart palpitate annoyingly when she heard the horse's footsteps on the gravel? When Miss Mary, who opened the door to Grandcourt, came to tell her that he was in the drawing-room? The hours of preparation and the triumph of the situation were apparently of no use. She might as well have seen Grandcourt coming suddenly on her in the midst of her despondency. While walking into the drawing-room she had to concentrate all her energy in that self-control which made her appear gravely gracious, as she gave her hand to him and answered his hope that she was quite well in a voice as low and languid as his own. A moment afterward, when they were both of them seated on two of the wreath-painted chairs, Gwendolen upright with downcast eyelids, Grandcourt about 2 yards distant, leaning one arm over the back of his chair and looking at her, while he held his hat in his left hand, any one seeing them as a picture would have concluded that they were in some stage of love-making suspense. And certainly the love-making had begun. She already felt herself being wooed by this silent man seated at an agreeable distance, with the subtlest atmosphere of attar of roses and an attention bent wholly on her. And he also considered himself to be wooing. He was not a man to suppose that his presence carried no consequences, and he was exactly the man to feel the utmost piquancy in a girl whom he had not found quite calculable. "I was disappointed not to find you at Leubronn," he began, his usual broken drawl having just a shade of amorous languor in it. "The place was intolerable without you. A mere kennel of a place. Don't you think so?" "I can't judge what it would be without myself," said Gwendolen, turning her eyes on him with some recovered sense of mischief. "With myself I like it well enough to have stayed longer, if I could, but I was obliged to come home on account of family troubles." "It was very cruel of you to go to Leubronn," said Grandcourt, taking no notice of the troubles on which Gwendolen, she hardly knew why, wished that there should be a clear understanding at once. "You must have known that it would spoil everything. You knew you were the heart and soul of everything that went on. Are you quite reckless about me?" It would be impossible to say yes in a tone that would be taken seriously, equally impossible to say no. But what else could she say? In her difficulty she turned down her eyelids again and blushed over her face and neck. Grandcourt saw her in a new phase, and believed that she was showing her inclination, but he was determined that she should show it more decidedly. "Perhaps there is some deeper interest, some attraction, some engagement, which it would have been only fair to make me aware of. Is there any man who stands between us?" Inwardly the answer framed itself. "No, but there is a woman." Yet how could she utter this? Even if she had not promised that woman to be silent, it would have been impossible for her to enter on the subject with Grandcourt. But how could she arrest his wooing by beginning to make a formal speech? "I perceive your intention. It is most flattering," etc. A fish honestly invited to come and be eaten has a clear course in declining, but how if it finds itself swimming against a net? And apart from the network, would she have dared at once to say anything decisive? Gwendolen had not time to be clear on that point. As it was, she felt compelled to silence, and after a pause Grandcourt said, "Am I to understand that someone else is preferred?" Gwendolen, now impatient of her own embarrassment, determined to rush at the difficulty and free herself. She raised her eyes again and said with something of her former clearness and defiance, "No," wishing him to understand. "What then? I may not be ready to take you." There was nothing that Grandcourt could not understand which he perceived likely to affect his amour propre. "The last thing I would do is to importune you. I should not hope to win you by making myself a bore. If there were no hope for me, I would ask you to tell me so at once, that I might just ride away to no matter where." Almost to her own astonishment, Gwendolen felt a sudden alarm at the image of Grandcourt finally riding away. What would be left her then? Nothing but the former dreariness. She liked him to be there. She snatched at the subject that would defer any decisive answer. "I fear you are not aware of what has happened to us. I have lately had to think so much of my mamma's troubles that other subjects have been quite thrown into the background. She has lost all her fortune, and we are going to leave this place. I must ask you to excuse my seeming preoccupied." In eluding a direct appeal, Gwendolen recovered some of her self-possession. She spoke with dignity and looked straight at Grandcourt, whose long, narrow, impenetrable eyes met hers and mysteriously arrested them. Mysteriously, for the subtly varied drama between man and woman is often such as can hardly be rendered in words put together like dominoes according to obvious fixed marks. The word of all work, love, will no more express the myriad modes of mutual attraction than the word thought can inform you what is passing through your neighbor's mind. It would be hard to tell on which side, Gwendolen's or Grandcourt's, the influence was more mixed. At that moment his strongest wish was to be completely master of this creature, this piquant combination of maidenliness and mischief. That she knew things which had made her start away from him spurred him to triumph over that repugnance, and he was believing that he should triumph. And she—ah, piteous equality in the need to dominate! She was overcome like the thirsty one who is drawn toward the seeming water in the desert, overcome by the suffused sense that here in this man's homage to her lay the rescue from helpless subjection to an oppressive lot. All the while they were looking at each other, and Grandcourt said, slowly and languidly, as if it were of no importance, other things having been settled, "You will tell me now, I hope, that Mrs. Davilow's loss of fortune will not trouble you further. You will trust me to prevent it from weighing upon her. You will give me the claim to provide against that." The little pauses and refined drawlings with which this speech was uttered gave time for Gwendolen to go through the dream of a life. As the words penetrated her, they had the effect of a draught of wine, which suddenly makes all things easier, desirable things not so wrong, and people in general less disagreeable. She had a momentary phantasmal love for this man who chose his words so well, and who was a mere incarnation of delicate homage. Repugnance, dread, scruples, these were dim as remembered pains, while she was already tasting relief under the immediate pain of hopelessness. She imagined herself already springing to her mother and being playful again. Yet when Grandcourt had ceased to speak, there was an instant in which she was conscious of being at the turning of the ways. "You are very generous," she said, not moving her eyes and speaking with a gentle intonation. "You accept what will make such things a matter of course?" said Grandcourt, without any new eagerness. "You consent to become my wife?" This time Gwendolen remained quite pale. Something made her rise from her seat in spite of herself and walk to a little distance. Then she turned, and with her hands folded before her, stood in silence. Grandcourt immediately rose too, resting his hat on the chair, but still keeping hold of it. The evident hesitation of this destitute girl to take his splendid offer stung him into a keenness of interest such as he had not known for years, none the less because he attributed her hesitation entirely to her knowledge about Mrs. Glasher. In that attitude of preparation he said, "Do you command me to go?" No familiar spirit could have suggested to him more effective words. "No," said Gwendolen. She could not let him go. That negative was a clutch. She seemed to herself to be, after all, only drifted toward the tremendous decision, but drifting depends on something besides the currents when the sails have been set beforehand. "You accept my devotion?" said Grandcourt, holding his hat by his side and looking straight into her eyes, without other movement. Their eyes meeting in that way seemed to allow any length of pause, but wait as long as she would, how could she contradict herself? What had she detained him for? He had shut out any explanation. "Yes," came as gravely from Gwendolen's lips as if she had been answering to her name in a court of justice. He received it gravely, and they still looked at each other in the same attitude. Was there ever such a way before of accepting the bliss-giving yes? Grandcourt liked better to be at that distance from her, and to feel under a ceremony imposed by an indefinable prohibition that breathed from Gwendolen's bearing. But he did at length lay down his hat and advance to take her hand, just pressing his lips upon it and letting it go again. She thought his behavior perfect, and gained a sense of freedom which made her almost ready to be mischievous. Her yes entailed so little at this moment that there was nothing to screen the reversal of her gloomy prospects. Her vision was filled by her own release from the Momperts and her mother's release from Sawyer's Cottage, With a happy curl of the lips, she said, "Will you not see mamma? I will fetch her." "Let us wait a little," said Grandcourt, in his favorite attitude, having his left forefinger and thumb in his waistcoat pocket, with his right hand caressing his whisker, while he stood near Gwendolen and looked at her, not unlike a gentleman who has a felicitous introduction at an evening party. "Have you anything else to say to me?" said Gwendolen, playfully. "Yes. I know having things said to you is a great bore," said Grandcourt, rather sympathetically. "Not when they are things I like to hear." "Will it bother you to be asked how soon we can be married?" "I think it will. To-day," said Gwendolen, putting up her chin saucily. "Not to-day, then, but to-morrow. Think of it before I come to-morrow. In a fortnight, or 3 weeks, as soon as possible." "Ah, you think you will be tired of my company," said Gwendolen. "I notice when people are married the husband is not so much with his wife as when they are engaged. But perhaps I shall like that better too." She laughed charmingly. "You shall have whatever you like," said Grandcourt. "And nothing that I don't like? Please say that, because I think I dislike what I don't like more than I like what I like," said Gwendolen, finding herself in the woman's paradise where all her nonsense is adorable. Grandcourt paused. These were subtleties in which he had much experience of his own. "I don't know. This is such a brute of a world. Things are always turning up that one doesn't like. I can't always hinder your being bored. If you like to ride Criterion, I can't hinder his coming down by some chance or other." "Ah, my friend Criterion, how is he?" "He is outside. I made the groom ride him, that you might see him. He had the side saddle on for an hour or two yesterday. Come to the window and look at him." They could see the two horses being taken slowly round the sweep, and the beautiful creatures in their fine grooming sent a thrill of exultation through Gwendolen. They were the symbols of command and luxury, in delightful contrast with the ugliness of poverty and humiliation at which she had lately been looking close. "Will you ride Criterion to-morrow?" said Grandcourt. "If you will, everything shall be arranged." "I should like it of all things," said Gwendolen. "I want to lose myself in a gallop again. But now I must go and fetch mamma." "Take my arm to the door, then," said Grandcourt, and she accepted. Their faces were very near each other, being almost on a level, and he was looking at her. She thought his manners as a lover more agreeable than any she had seen described. She had no alarm lest he meant to kiss her, and was so much at her ease that she suddenly paused in the middle of the room and said half archly, half earnestly, "Oh, while I think of it, there is something I dislike that you can save me from. I do not like Mr. Lush's company." "You shall not have it. I'll get rid of him." "You are not fond of him yourself?" "Not in the least. I let him hang on me because he has always been a poor devil," said Grandcourt, in an adagio of utter indifference. "They got him to travel with me when I was a lad. He was always that coarse-haired kind of brute—sort of a cross between a hog and a dilettante." Gwendolen laughed, and that seemed kind and natural enough. Grandcourt's fastidiousness enhanced the kindness, and when they reached the door, his way of opening it for her was the perfection of easy homage. Really, she thought, he was likely to be the least disagreeable of husbands. Mrs. Davilow was waiting anxiously in her bedroom when Gwendolen entered, stepped toward her quickly, and kissing her on both cheeks, said in a low tone, "Come now, mamma, and see Mr. Grandcourt. I am engaged to him." "My darling child!" said Mrs. Davilow, with a surprise that was rather solemn than glad. "Yes," said Gwendolen in the same tone, and with a quickness which implied that it was needless to ask questions. "Everything is settled. You are not going to Sawyer's Cottage, and I am not going to be inspected by Mrs. Mompert, and everything is to be as I like. So come down with me immediately." End of Chapter 27. End of Book 3. This recording is in the public domain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Daniel Deronda by George Eliot. Chapter 28.
Il est plus aisé de connaître l'homme en général que de connaître un homme en particulier. La Rochefoucauld.
An hour after Grandcourt had left, the important news of Gwendolen's engagement was known at the rectory, and Mr. and Mrs. Gascoigne with Anna spent the evening at Offendene. "My dear, let me congratulate you on having created a strong attachment," said the rector. "You look serious, and I don't wonder at it. A lifetime union is a solemn thing. But from the way Mr. Grandcourt has acted and spoken, I think we may already see some good arising out of our adversity. It has given you an opportunity of observing your future husband's delicate liberality." Mr. Gascoigne referred to Grandcourt's mode of implying that he would provide for Mrs. Davilow, a part of the love-making which Gwendolen had remembered to cite to her mother with perfect accuracy. "But I have no doubt that Mr. Grandcourt would have behaved quite as handsomely if you had not gone away to Germany, Gwendolen, and had been engaged to him, as you no doubt might have been, more than a month ago," said Mrs. Gascoigne, feeling that she had to discharge a duty on this occasion. "But now there is no more room for caprice. Indeed, I trust you have no inclination to any. A woman has a great debt of gratitude to a man who perseveres in making her such an offer. But no doubt you feel properly." "I am not at all sure that I do, aunt," said Gwendolen, with saucy gravity. "I don't know everything it is proper to feel on being engaged." The rector patted her shoulder and smiled as at a bit of innocent naughtiness, and his wife took his behavior as an indication that she was not to be displeased. As for Anna, she kissed Gwendolen and said, "I do hope you will be happy," but then sank into the background and tried to keep the tears back too. In the late days she had been imagining a little romance about Rex. How if he still longed for Gwendolen, her heart might be softened by trouble into love, so that they could by and by be married. And the romance had turned to a prayer that she, Anna, might be able to rejoice like a good sister, and only think of being useful in working for Gwendolen, as long as Rex was not rich. But now she wanted Grace to rejoice in something else. Miss Mary and the four girls, Alice with the high shoulders, Bertha and Fanny the whisperers, and Isabel the listener, were all present on this family occasion, when everything seemed appropriately turning to the honor and glory of Gwendolen, and real life was as interesting as Sir Charles Grandison. The evening passed chiefly in decisive remarks from the rector in answer to conjectures from the two elder ladies. According to him, the case was not one in which he could think it his duty to mention settlements. Everything must and doubtless would safely be left to Mr. Grandcourt. "I should like to know exactly what sort of places Ryelands and Gadsmere are," said Mrs. Davilow. "Gadsmere, I believe, is a secondary place," said Mr. Gascoigne, "but Ryelands I know to be one of our finest seats. The park is extensive, and the woods are of very valuable order. The house was built by Inigo Jones, and the ceilings are painted in the Italian style. The estate is said to be worth 12,000 a year, and there are two livings, one a rectory, in the gift of the Grandcourts. There may be some burdens on the land. Still, Mr. Grandcourt was an only child." "It would be most remarkable," said Mrs. Gascoigne, "if he were to become Lord Stannery in addition to everything else. Only think, there is the Grandcourt estate, the Mallinger estate, and the baronetcy, and the peerage." She was marking off the items on her fingers, and paused on the fourth while she added, "But they say there will be no land coming to him with the peerage." It seemed a pity there was nothing for the fifth finger. "The peerage," said the rector judiciously, "must be regarded as a remote chance. There are two cousins between the present peer and Mr. Grandcourt. It is certainly a serious reflection how death and other causes do sometimes concentrate inheritances on one man. But an excess of that kind is to be deprecated. To be Sir Mallinger Grandcourt Mallinger—I suppose that will be his style—with corresponding properties, is a valuable talent enough for any man to have committed to him. Let us hope it will be well used." "And what a position for the wife, Gwendolen!" said Mrs. Gascoigne. "A great responsibility indeed. But you must lose no time in writing to Mrs. Mompert, Henry. It is a good thing that you have an engagement of marriage to offer as an excuse, else she might feel offended. She is rather a high woman." "I am rid of that honor," thought Gwendolen, to whom the name of Mompert had become a sort of mumbo-jumbo. She was very silent through the evening, and that night could hardly sleep at all in her little white bed. It was a rarity in her strong youth to be wakeful, and perhaps a still greater rarity for her to be careful that her mother should not know of her restlessness. But her state of mind was altogether new. She who had been used to feel sure of herself and ready to manage others had just taken a decisive step which she had beforehand thought that she would not take, nay, perhaps was bound not to take. She could not go backward now. She liked a great deal of what lay before her, and there was nothing for her to like if she went back. But her resolution was dogged by the shadow of that previous resolve which had at first come as the undoubting movement of her whole being. While she lay on her pillow with wide open eyes, looking on darkness which the blind do see, she was appalled by the idea that she was going to do what she had once started away from with repugnance. It was new to her that a question of right or wrong in her conduct should rouse her terror. She had known no compunction that atoning caresses and presents could not lay to rest. But here had come a moment when something like a new consciousness was awakened. She seemed on the edge of adopting deliberately, as a notion for all the rest of her life, what she had rashly said in her bitterness, when her discovery had driven her away to Leubronn, that it did not signify what she did, she had only to amuse herself as best she could. That lawlessness, that casting away of all care for justification suddenly frightened her. It came to her with the shadowy array of possible calamity behind it, calamity which had ceased to be a mere name for her, and all the infiltrated influences of disregarded religious teaching, as well as the deeper impressions of something awful and inexorable enveloping her, seemed to concentrate themselves in the vague conception of avenging power. The brilliant position she had longed for, the imagined freedom she would create for herself in marriage, the deliverance from the dull insignificance of her girlhood, all immediately before her, and yet they had come to her hunger like food with the taint of sacrilege upon it, which she must snatch with terror. In the darkness and loneliness of her little bed, her more resistant self could not act against the first onslaught of dread after her irrevocable decision. That unhappy-faced woman and her children, Grandcourt and his relations with her, kept repeating themselves in her imagination like the clinging memory of a disgrace, and gradually obliterated all other thought, leaving only the consciousness that she had taken those scenes into her life. Her long wakefulness seemed a delirium. A faint, faint light penetrated beside the window curtain. The chillness increased. She could bear it no longer, and cried, "Mamma!" "Yes, dear," said Mrs. Davilow immediately, in a wakeful voice. "Let me come to you." She soon went to sleep on her mother's shoulder, and slept on till late, when, dreaming of a lit-up ballroom, she opened her eyes on her mother standing by the bedside with a small packet in her hand. "I am sorry to wake you, darling, but I thought it better to give you this at once. The groom has brought Criterion. He has come on another horse, and says he is to stay here." Gwendolen sat up in bed and opened the packet. It was a delicate enameled casket, and inside was a splendid diamond ring with a letter which contained a folded bit of colored paper and these words: "Pray wear this ring when I come at 12 in sign of our betrothal. I enclose a check drawn in the name of Mr. Gascoigne for immediate expenses. Of course Mrs. Davilow will remain at Offendene, at least for some time. I hope when I come you will have granted me an early day, when you may begin to command me at a shorter distance. Yours devotedly, H. M. Grandcourt." The check was for £500, and Gwendolen turned it toward her mother with the letter. "How very kind and delicate," said Mrs. Davilow, with much feeling. "But I really should like better not to be dependent on a son-in-law. I and the girls could get along very well." "Mamma, if you say that again I will not marry him," said Gwendolen angrily. "My dear child, I trust you are not going to marry only for my sake," said Mrs. Davilow, deprecatingly. Gwendolen tossed her head on the pillow away from her mother, and let the ring lie. She was irritated at this attempt to take away a motive. Perhaps the deeper cause of her irritation was the consciousness that she was not going to marry solely for her mamma's sake, that she was drawn toward the marriage in ways against which stronger reasons than her mother's renunciation were yet not strong enough to hinder her. She had waked up to the signs that she was irrevocably engaged, and all the ugly visions, the alarms, the arguments of the night must be met by daylight, in which probably they would show themselves weak. "What I long for is your happiness, dear," continued Mrs. Davilow, pleadingly. "I will not say anything to vex you. Will you put on the ring?" For a few moments Gwendolen did not answer, but her thoughts were active. At last she raised herself with a determination to do as she would do if she had started on horseback, and go on with spirit whatever ideas might be running in her head. "I thought the lover always put on the betrothal ring himself," she said, laughingly, slipping the ring on her finger and looking at it with a charming movement of her head. "I know why he has sent it," she added, nodding at her mother. "Why?" "He would rather make me put it on than ask me to let him do it. Aha! He is very proud. But so am I. We shall match each other. I should hate a man who went down on his knees and came fawning on me. He really is not disgusting." "That is very moderate praise, Gwen." "No, it is not, for a man," said Gwendolen, gaily. "But now I must get up and dress. Will you come and do my hair, mamma dear?" she went on, drawing down her mamma's face to caress it with her own cheeks. "And not be so naughty any more as to talk of living in poverty? You must bear to be made comfortable, even if you don't like it. And Mr. Grandcourt behaves perfectly now, does he not?" "Certainly he does," said Mrs. Davilow, encouraged, and persuaded that after all Gwendolen was fond of her betrothed. She herself thought him a man whose attentions were likely to tell on a girl's feeling. Suitors must often be judged, as words are, by the standing and the figure they make in polite society. It is difficult to know much else of them. And all the mother's anxiety turned not on Grandcourt's character, but on Gwendolen's mood in accepting him. The mood was necessarily passing through a new phase this morning. Even in the hour of making her toilette, she had drawn on all the knowledge she had for grounds to justify her marriage, and what she most dwelt on was the determination that when she was Grandcourt's wife she would urge him to the most liberal conduct toward Mrs. Glasher's children. "Of what use would it be to her that I should not marry him? He could have married her if he liked, but he did not like. Perhaps she is to blame for that. There must be a great deal about her that I know nothing of, and he must have been good to her in many ways, else she would not have wanted to marry him." But that last argument at once began to appear doubtful. Mrs. Glasher naturally wished to exclude other children who would stand between Grandcourt and her own, and Gwendolen's comprehension of this feeling prompted another way of reconciling claims. "Perhaps we shall have no children. I hope we shall not. And he might leave the estate to the pretty little boy. My uncle said that Mr. Grandcourt would do as he liked with the estates. Only when Sir Hugo Mallinger dies there will be enough for two." This made Mrs. Glasher appear quite unreasonable in demanding that her boy should be sole heir, and the double property was a security that Grandcourt's marriage would do her no wrong, when the wife was Gwendolen Harleth, with all her proud resolution not to be fairly accused. This maiden had been accustomed to think herself blameless. Other persons only were faulty. It was striking that in the hold which this argument of her doing no wrong to Mrs. Glasher had taken on her mind, her repugnance to the idea of Grandcourt's past had sunk into a subordinate feeling. The terror she had felt in the night watches at overstepping the border of wickedness by doing what she had at first felt to be wrong had dulled any emotions about his conduct. She was thinking of him, whatever he might be, as a man over whom she was going to have indefinite power, and her loving him having never been a question with her, any agreeableness he had was so much gain. Poor Gwendolen had no awe of unmanageable forces in the state of matrimony, but regarded it as altogether a matter of management, in which she would know how to act. In relation to Grandcourt's past, she encouraged new doubts whether he were likely to have differed much from other men, and she devised little schemes for learning what was expected of men in general. But whatever else might be true in the world, her hair was dressed suitably for riding, and she went down in her riding habit to avoid delay before getting on horseback. She wanted to have her blood stirred once more with the intoxication of youth, and to recover the daring with which she had been used to think of her course in life. Already a load was lifted off her, for in daylight and activity it was less oppressive to have doubts about her choice than to feel that she had no choice but to endure insignificance and servitude. "Go back and make yourself look like a duchess, mamma," she said, turning suddenly as she was going downstairs. "Put your point lace over your head. I must have you look like a duchess. You must not take things humbly." When Grandcourt raised her left hand gently and looked at the ring, she said gravely, "It was very good of you to think of everything and send me that packet." "You will tell me if there is anything I forget," he said, keeping the hand softly within his own. "I will do anything you wish." "But I am very unreasonable in my wishes," said Gwendolen, smiling. "Yes, and I expect that. Women always are." "Then I will not be unreasonable," said Gwendolen, taking away her hand and tossing her head saucily. "I will not be told that I am what women always are." "I did not say that," said Grandcourt, looking at her with his usual gravity. "You are what no other woman is." "And what is that, pray?" said Gwendolen, moving to a distance with a little air of menace. Grandcourt made his pause before he answered. "You are the woman I love." "Oh, what nice speeches!" said Gwendolen, laughing. The sense of that love which he must once have given to another woman under strange circumstances was getting familiar. "Give me a nice speech in return. Say when we are to be married." "Not yet—not till we have had a gallop over the downs. I am so thirsty for that I can think of nothing else. I wish the hunting had begun. Sunday the 20th, 27th, Monday, Tuesday." Gwendolen was counting on her fingers with the prettiest nod while she looked at Grandcourt, and at last swept one palm over the other while she said triumphantly, "It will begin in 10 days." "Let us be married in 10 days, then," said Grandcourt, "and we shall not be bored about the stables." "What do women always say in answer to that?" said Gwendolen, mischievously. "They agree to it," said the lover, rather off his guard. "Then I will not," said Gwendolen, taking up her gauntlets and putting them on while she kept her eyes on him with gathering fun in them. The scene was pleasant on both sides. A cruder lover would have lost the view of her pretty ways and attitudes, and spoiled all by stupid attempts at caresses, utterly destructive of drama. Grandcourt preferred the drama, and Gwendolen, left at ease, found her spirits rising continually as she played at reigning. Perhaps if Klesmer had seen more of her in this unconscious kind of acting, instead of when she was trying to be theatrical, he might have rated her chance higher. When they had had a glorious gallop, however, she was in a state of exhilaration that disposed her to think well of hastening the marriage, which would make her life all of a piece with this splendid kind of enjoyment. She would not debate any more about an act to which she had committed herself, and she consented to fix the wedding on that day 3 weeks, notwithstanding the difficulty of fulfilling the customary laws of the trousseau. Lush, of course, was made aware of the engagement by abundant signs, without being formally told, but he expected some communication as a consequence of it, and after a few days he became rather impatient under Grandcourt's silence, feeling sure that the change would affect his personal prospects, and wishing to know exactly how. His tactics no longer included any opposition, which he did not love for its own sake. He might easily cause Grandcourt a great deal of annoyance, but it would be to his own injury, and to create annoyance was not a motive with him. Miss Gwendolen he would certainly not have been sorry to frustrate a little, but, after all, there was no knowing what would come. It was nothing new that Grandcourt should show a perverse willfulness, yet in his freak about this girl he struck Lush rather newly as something like a man who was fey, led on by an ominous fatality, and that one born to his fortune should make a worse business of his life than was necessary seemed really pitiable. Having protested against the marriage, Lush had a second sight for its evil consequences. Grandcourt had been taking the pains to write letters and give orders himself instead of employing Lush, and appeared to be ignoring his usefulness, even choosing, against the habit of years, to breakfast alone in his dressing-room. But a tête-à-tête was not to be avoided in a house empty of guests, and Lush hastened to use an opportunity of saying, it was one day after dinner, for there were difficulties in Grandcourt's dining at Offendene, "And when is the marriage to take place?" Grandcourt, who drank little wine, had left the table and was lounging while he smoked in an easy-chair near the hearth, where a fire of oak boughs was gaping to its glowing depths and edging them with a delicate tint of ashes delightful to behold. The chair of red-brown velvet brocade was a becoming background for his pale-tinted, well-cut features and exquisite long hands. Omitting the cigar, you might have imagined him a portrait by Moroni, who would have rendered wonderfully the impenetrable gaze and air of distinction. And a portrait by that great master would have been quite as lively a companion as Grandcourt was disposed to be. But he answered without unusual delay, "On the 10th." "I suppose you intend to remain here?" "We shall go to Ryelands for a little while, but we shall return here for the sake of the hunting." After this word there was the languid, inarticulate sound frequent with Grandcourt when he meant to continue speaking, and Lush waited for something more. Nothing came, and he was going to put another question, when the inarticulate sound began again and introduced the mildly uttered suggestion, "You had better make some new arrangement for yourself." "What? I am to cut and run," said Lush, prepared to be good-tempered on the occasion. "Something of that kind. The bride objects to me. I hope she will make up to you for the want of my services." "I can't help your being so damnably disagreeable to women," said Grandcourt, in soothing apology. "To one woman, if you please. It makes no difference, since she is the one in question. I suppose I am not to be turned adrift after 15 years without some provision? You must have saved something out of me." "Deuced little. I have often saved something for you." "You can have 300 a year, but you must live in town and be ready to look after things when I want you. I shall be rather hard up." "If you are not going to be at Ryelands this winter, I might run down there and let you know how Swinton goes on." "If you like. I don't care a toss where you are, so that you keep out of sight." "Much obliged," said Lush, able to take the affair more easily than he had expected. He was supported by the secret belief that he should by and by be wanted as much as ever. "Perhaps you will not object to packing up as soon as possible," said Grandcourt. "The Torringtons are coming, and Miss Harleth will be riding over here." "With all my heart. Can't I be of use in going to Gadsmere?" "No, I am going myself." "About your being rather hard up. Have you thought of that plan—" "Just leave me alone, will you?" said Grandcourt, in his lowest audible tone, tossing his cigar into the fire and rising to walk away. He spent the evening in the solitude of the smaller drawing-room, where, with various new publications on the table of the kind a gentleman may like to have on hand without touching, he employed himself, as a philosopher might have done, in sitting meditatively on the sofa and abstaining from literature, political, comic, cynical, or romantic. In this way hours may pass surprisingly soon without the arduous invisible chase of philosophy, not from love of thought, but from hatred of effort, from a state of the inward world something like premature age, where the need for action lapses into a mere image of what has been, is, and may or may not be, where impulse is born and dies in a phantasmal world, pausing in rejection of even a shadowy fulfillment. That is a condition which often comes with whitening hair, and sometimes, too, an intense obstinacy and tenacity of rule, like the main trunk of an exorbitant egoism, conspicuous in proportion as the varied susceptibilities of younger years are stripped away. But Grandcourt's hair, though he had not much of it, was of a fine sunny blonde, and his moods were not entirely to be explained as ebbing energy. We mortals have a strange spiritual chemistry going on within us, so that a lazy stagnation or even a cottony milkiness may be preparing one knows not what biting or explosive material. The navvy, waking from sleep and without malice heaving a stone to crush the life out of his still sleeping comrade, is understood to lack the trained motive which makes a character fairly calculable in its actions. But by a roundabout course even a gentleman may make of himself a chancy personage, raising an uncertainty as to what he may do next that sadly spoils companionship. Grandcourt's thoughts this evening were like the circlets one sees in a dark pool, continually dying out and continually started again by some impulse from below the surface. The deeper central impulse came from the image of Gwendolen, but the thoughts it stirred would be imperfectly illustrated by a reference to the amatory poets of all ages. It was characteristic that he got none of his satisfaction from the belief that Gwendolen was in love with him, and that love had overcome the jealous resentment which had made her run away from him. On the contrary, he believed that this girl was rather exceptional in the fact that, in spite of his assiduous attention to her, she was not in love with him. And it seemed to him very likely that if it had not been for the sudden poverty which had come over her family, she would not have accepted him. From the very first there had been an exasperating fascination in the tricksiness with which she had, not met his advances, but wheeled away from them. She had been brought to accept him in spite of everything, brought to kneel down like a horse under training for the arena, though she might have an objection to it all the while. On the whole, Grandcourt got more pleasure out of this notion than he could have done out of winning a girl of whom he was sure that she had a strong inclination for him personally. And yet this pleasure in mastering reluctance flourished along with the habitual persuasion that no woman whom he favored could be quite indifferent to his personal influence. And it seemed to him not unlikely that by and by Gwendolen might be more enamored of him than he of her. In any case she would have to submit, and he enjoyed thinking of her as his future wife, whose pride and spirit were suited to command every one but himself. He had no taste for a woman who was all tenderness to him, full of petitioning solicitude and willing obedience. He meant to be master of a woman who would have liked to master him, and who perhaps would have been capable of mastering another man. Lush, having failed in his attempted reminder to Grandcourt, thought it well to communicate with Sir Hugo, in whom, as a man having perhaps interest enough to command the bestowal of some place where the work was light, gentlemanly, and not ill paid, he was anxious to cultivate a sense of friendly obligation, not feeling at all secure against the future need of such a place. He wrote the following letter and addressed it to Park Lane, whither he knew the family had returned from Leubronn. My dear Sir Hugo, since we came home the marriage has been absolutely decided on and is to take place in less than 3 weeks. It is so far the worse for him that her mother has lately lost all her fortune, and he will have to find supplies. Grandcourt, I know, is feeling the want of cash, and unless some other plan is resorted to, he will be raising money in a foolish way. I am going to leave Diplow immediately, and I shall not be able to start the topic. What I should advise is, that Mr. Deronda, who I know has your confidence, should propose to come and pay a short visit here, according to invitation. There are going to be other people in the house, and that you should put him fully in possession of your wishes and the possible extent of your offer. Then that he should introduce the subject to Grandcourt so as not to imply that you suspect any particular want of money on his part, but only that there is a strong wish on yours. What I have formerly said to him has been in the way of a conjecture that you might be willing to give a good sum for his chance of Diplow. But if Mr. Deronda came armed with a definite offer, that would take another sort of hold. 10 to 1 he will not close for some time to come, but the proposal will have got a stronger lodgment in his mind, and though at present he has a great notion of the hunting here, I see a likelihood, under the circumstances, that he will get a distaste for the neighborhood, and there will be the notion of the money sticking by him without being urged. I would bet on your ultimate success. As I am not to be exiled to Siberia, but am to be within call, it is possible that by and by I may be of more service to you. But at present I can think of no medium so good as Mr. Deronda. Nothing puts Grandcourt in worse humor than having the lawyers thrust their paper under his nose uninvited. Trusting that your visit to Leubronn has put you in excellent condition for the winter, I remain, my dear Sir Hugo, yours very faithfully, Thomas Cranmer Lush. Sir Hugo, having received this letter at breakfast, handed it to Deronda, who, though he had chambers in town, was somehow hardly ever in them, Sir Hugo not being contented without him. The chatty baronet would have liked a young companion even if there had been no peculiar reasons for attachment between them, one with a fine, harmonious, unspoiled face, fitted to keep up a cheerful view of posterity and inheritance generally, notwithstanding particular disappointments. And his affection for Deronda was not diminished by the deep-lying though not obtrusive difference in their notions and tastes. Perhaps it was all the stronger, acting as the same sort of difference does between a man and a woman in giving a piquancy to the attachment which subsists in spite of it. Sir Hugo did not think unapprovingly of himself, but he looked at men and society from a liberal menagerie point of view, and he had a certain pride in Deronda's differing from him, which, if it had found voice, might have said, "You see this fine young fellow? Not such as you see every day, is he? He belongs to me in a sort of way. I brought him up from a child. But you would not ticket him off easily. He has notions of his own, and he's as far as the poles asunder from what I was at his age." This state of feeling was kept up by the mental balance in Deronda, who was moved by an affectionateness such as we are apt to call feminine, disposing him to yield in ordinary details while he had a certain inflexibility of judgment and independence of opinion held to be rightfully masculine. When he had read the letter, he returned it without speaking, inwardly wincing under Lush's mode of attributing a neutral usefulness to him in the family affairs. "What do you say, Dan? It would be pleasant enough for you. You have not seen the place for a good many years now, and you might have a famous run with the harriers if you went down next week," said Sir Hugo. "I should not go on that account," said Deronda, buttering his bread attentively. He had an objection to this transparent kind of persuasiveness, which all intelligent animals are seen to treat with indifference. If he went to Diplow he should be doing something disagreeable to oblige Sir Hugo. "I think Lush's notion is a good one, and it would be a pity to lose the occasion." "That is a different matter, if you think my going of importance to your objects," said Deronda, still with that aloofness of manner which implied some suppression. He knew that the baronet had set his heart on the affair. "Why, you will see the fair gambler, the Leubronn Diana, I shouldn't wonder," said Sir Hugo gaily. "We shall have to invite her to the Abbey when they are married," he added, turning to Lady Mallinger, as if she too had read the letter. "I cannot conceive whom you mean," said Lady Mallinger, who in fact had not been listening, her mind having been taken up with her first sips of coffee, the objectionable cuff of her sleeve, and the necessity of carrying Teresa to the dentist, innocent and partly laudable preoccupations as the gentle ladies usually were. Should her appearance be inquired after, let it be said that she had reddish blonde hair, the hair of the period, a small Roman nose, rather prominent blue eyes, and delicate eyelids, with a figure which her thinner friends called fat, her hands showing curves and dimples like a magnified baby's. "I mean that Grandcourt is going to marry the girl you saw at Leubronn. Don't you remember her? The Miss Harleth who used to play at roulette." "Dear me! Is that a good match for him?" "That depends on the sort of goodness he wants," said Sir Hugo, smiling. "However, she and her friends have nothing, and she will bring him expenses. It's a good match for my purposes, because if I am willing to fork out a sum of money, he may be willing to give up his chance of Diplow, so that we shall have it out and out, and when I die you will have the consolation of going to the place you would like to go to, wherever I may go." I wish you would not talk of dying in that light way, dear." "It's rather a heavy way, Lou, for I shall have to pay a heavy sum—40,000 at least." "But why are we to invite them to the Abbey?" said Lady Mallinger. "I do not like women who gamble, like Lady Cragstone." "Oh, you will not mind her for a week. Besides, she is not like Lady Cragstone because she gambled a little, any more than I am like a broker because I'm a Whig. I want to keep Grandcourt in good humor, and to let him see plenty of this place, that he may think the less of Diplow. I don't know yet whether I shall get him to meet me in this matter, and if Dan were to go over on a visit there, he might hold out the bait to him. It would be doing me a great service." This was meant for Deronda. "Daniel is not fond of Mr. Grandcourt, I think, is he?" said Lady Mallinger, looking at Deronda inquiringly. "There is no avoiding everybody one doesn't happen to be fond of," said Deronda. "I will go to Diplow. I don't know that I have anything better to do, since Sir Hugo wishes it." "That's a trump!" said Sir Hugo, well pleased. "And if you don't find it very pleasant, it's so much experience. Nothing used to come amiss to me when I was young. You must see men and manners." "Yes, but I have seen that man, and something of his manners too," said Deronda. "Not nice manners, I think," said Lady Mallinger. "Well, you see they succeed with your sex," said Sir Hugo, provokingly. "And he was an uncommonly good‐looking fellow when he was 22 or 23, like his father. He doesn't take after his father in marrying the heiress, though. If he had got Miss Arrowpoint and my land too, confound him, he would have had a fine principality." Deronda, in anticipating the projected visit, felt less disinclination than when consenting to it. The story of that girl's marriage did interest him. What he had heard through Lush of her having run away from the suit of the man she was now going to take as a husband had thrown a new sort of light on her gambling, and it was probably the transition from that fevered worldliness into poverty which had urged her acceptance where she must in some way have felt repulsion. All this implied a nature liable to difficulty and struggle, elements of life which had a predominant attraction for his sympathy, due perhaps to his early pain in dwelling on the conjectured story of his own existence. Persons attracted him as Hans Meyrick had done, in proportion to the possibility of his defending them, rescuing them, telling upon their lives with some sort of redeeming influence; and he had to resist an inclination, easily accounted for, to withdraw coldly from the fortunate. But in the movement which had led him to repurchase Gwendolen's necklace for her, and which was at work in him still, there was something beyond his habitual compassionate fervor, something due to the fascination of her womanhood. He was very open to that sort of charm, and mingled it with the consciously Utopian pictures of his own future. Yet one able to trace the folds of his character might have conceived that he would be more likely than many less passionate men to love a woman without telling her of it. Sprinkle food before a delicate-eared bird, there is nothing he would more willingly take, yet he keeps aloof, because of his sensibility to checks which to you are imperceptible. And one man differs from another, as we all differ from the Bosjesmen, in a sensibility to checks that come from variety of needs, spiritual or other. It seemed to foreshadow that capability of reticence in Deronda, that his imagination was much occupied with two women, to neither of whom would he have held it possible that he should ever make love. Hans Meyrick had laughed at him for having something of the knight-errant in his disposition, and he would have found his proof if he had known what was just now going on in Deronda's mind about Mirah and Gwendolen. Deronda wrote without delay to announce his visit to Diplow, and received in reply a polite assurance that his coming would give great pleasure. That was not altogether untrue. Grandcourt thought it probable that the visit was prompted by Sir Hugo's desire to court him for a purpose which he did not make up his mind to resist. And it was not a disagreeable idea to him that this fine fellow, whom he believed to be his cousin under the rose, would witness, perhaps with some jealousy, Henleigh Mallinger Grandcourt play the commanding part of betrothed lover to a splendid girl whom the cousin had already looked at with admiration. Grandcourt himself was not jealous of anything unless it threatened his mastery, which he did not think himself likely to lose. End of chapter 28. This recording is in the public domain.